All right, we're here this afternoon with Professor Dan Philpott, political science professor at the University of Notre Dame. He's done work on topics of the resurgence of religion in global politics, religious freedom in the Islamic context, and reconciliation in the international context, which is the topic he'll address with us today. So Professor Philpott, thanks for being with us.
Yes, likewise, Eduardo. Great to be with you.
So I thought to start, maybe just to put some real meat on the bones here, could you take us through a couple of examples of international reconciliation in the past or the recent past, maybe some successes and miracles, or maybe some failures and more messy situations, just so we have a real grasp on what it is we're talking about here.
Sure. Well, let's set the stage a little bit, which is that in the last half century or so, there has been a whole wave of countries that have made transitions away from dictatorship towards democracy, or away from war and towards a peace settlement. So for instance, political scientists speak about the wave of democracy. Sometimes they call it a third wave or a fourth wave. Over 90 countries have made a transition towards democracy, or a stride towards democracy. And in the wake of these transitions, there is often a very urgent call to look at the injustices that were committed in the dictatorship or during the war, and to say, how do we address them? How do we, the wounds and the injustices persist, such that there are demands on the part of people to go back and look at those things and say, how do we deal with those? Do we try all the criminals, and or do we human rights violators? Do we have another big thing countries have done is a truth commission, where we try to get a record of the truth about a country's violations. There are reparations, there are apologies. Then there has also emerged a kind of discourse and practice of forgiveness, which is fairly new arrival in global politics. So multiple countries and places have sought to do this. So in line with your question, who has done it best? Well, probably the most famous place to deal with it all is South Africa, which had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission following its transition from apartheid in the early 1990s. And of course, Nelson Mandela is a world historical figure. He's one of those figures who we just kind of see as like one of the great people of recent history. And one of the things he did after the transition from the apartheid regime, when he took over the presidency in South Africa, he really called for reconciliation and a kind of rejection of revenge and punishment, and he wanted other Blacks to forgive. And this could be controversial, but he set an example of forgiveness as well. And South Africa also had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was a commission that met for some 3 years, which sought to create a kind of comprehensive record of the country's past of apartheid. And it interviewed, had hearings where it went around the country interviewing victims and hearing testimony from victims. They were televised, often very searing testimony, but everybody heard it. But it enabled the country to have a kind of public conversation about our past. And now the price of the Truth Commission was, in order to get everybody to agree to it, they had to agree to amnesty for the apartheid officials and government leaders who had committed terrible human rights violations. So the basic bargain was, if you agree to step down and leave power, we'll have a Truth Commission, but if you testify in the Truth Commission, you'll get amnesty. So it was kind of an amnesty for truth deal, but they did get a record of the truth. Archbishop Tutu was also Archbishop Desmond Tutu was the Anglican archbishop who had won the Nobel Peace Prize, and then he was the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And he uh, he also talked a lot about forgiveness and about restorative justice, and often in very Christian terms. So anyway, there are problems with South Africa. There are debates. Many people would say, well, it was just a compromise uh, between power positions. People look at the massive amounts of levels of crime today and persistent economic injustices. Did it really make a difference? Well, I think all in all, it did. That if it hadn't been for that commission, there may very well have been a civil war um, between the opponents of apartheid and the regime. I can't prove that. Nobody can. But I think if you look at before and after, if you look at the problem that it solved, I think it was a success in that sense. Yeah, go ahead.
Are there any contexts that you can point to where the level of success was not as decisive and clear, and what went wrong there in context?
Yeah. Well, there are other places where countries have sought to address their past in one way or another, but it hasn't been so successful. I look at Japan, for instance. Now, Japan is a case of a longstanding democracy that is facing its past injustices of many years past. And so, over the course of its history after World War II, there were calls for Japan to kind of address the atrocities committed by the Japanese army in Korea and in China, and other places too. And nothing terribly significant happened until the 1990s, when some prime ministers did in fact issue apologies, and they started to become more common. However, the problem is that those apologies were not uniformly or widely well received by the population. In fact, there was a kind of nationalist backlash. It was kind of a nationalist party who said, no, we don't want to think of our country as guilty or sorrowful or contrite. In fact, we were more of a victim of the crimes during that period. Our country was hijacked, and we were in a war with other countries who were fighting us, and we were more victims than we were perpetrators. And so there was a kind of nationalist backlash, and the apologies were very controversial. But so that's an example of where, it's been a lot more fraught.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's very interesting. So stepping back maybe here a little bit, you write a bit about the International Criminal Court as sort of this international body that in a sense prosecutes, right, some of these questions of crimes and so forth. So take us a little bit there and kind of what your analysis is of their approach to reconciliation.
Yeah. Well, if I could again just take a step back and talk about some of the underlying currents, and then I'll get to the court. But one thing that I've noticed when I've studied this and also been involved personally in some countries dealing with their past was warring paradigms. Now, the dominant notion, you ask the question, how do we deal with past injustices? What is the meaning of justice in the wake of massive injustices? The dominant notion is what might be called the liberal peace. When I say dominant, I mean, it is the notion of the international community, the UN diplomats and the human rights workers and the Western diplomats and the international lawyers, the people who would speak for the international community. And they usually speak in the language of liberalism, human rights, the rule of law, but then their greatest aspiration is to have international criminal prosecutions for the worst human rights violators. This is the ultimate expression of the rule of law, that if you've committed terrible atrocities, you will be held accountable through a trial that gives you a fair trial with all the representation and everything. But then if found guilty, then you'll do time. And this is seen as kind of what I would call the great aspiration of the liberal peace. And so in 2002, there was the Treaty of Rome, 1998 was the Treaty of Rome, which established the International Criminal Court, which began operation in 2002. And if you go to The Hague in the Netherlands, there are these kind of twin glass towers, these kind of postmodern glass towers that kind of, they look very European. And so this is where the International Criminal Court is housed. And I call that the kind of the cathedral of the liberal peace, because that's kind of their, they have a kind of almost a religious like fervent devotion to this aspiration. I say that a little bit mockingly. I don't reject the International Criminal Court or what it's trying to do. In a way, they're trying to revive what the Nuremberg trials did after World War II, which is that you could have justice, you could have accountability for people who commit some of the worst crimes imaginable. And I think it's a good thing that they're trying to do, and I hope that that would emerge. However, if that is seen as the kind of overall, vision for a just peace, there I would, call it into question. Like how much, and what I would ask is, well, okay, so you try 2 or 3 arch criminals, and by the way, in the whole 20-year history, there have been only a handful of individuals who have ever been convicted, right? So while these trials are dragging out for many years and it's very hard to arrest any of them and so forth, well, what about the people back in Congo or Uganda or Colombia or what have you? They're still desperately needing a peace where they can, move on and live together again. So I think what I would argue that in addition to the rule of law and human rights and criminal trials, which are good things, you need a far wider conception that will really help to bring peace to the people on the ground. And that's where I would say you find the other paradigm, which is reconciliation, which has been articulated by people around the world, such as Bishop Tutu. And often that is articulated by religious leaders. But reconciliation calls for a kind of restoration of right relationship, more of a stress on healing, restoration, mercy, maybe even forgiveness, not to the expense of those other things, but in a way that helps to restore peace on the ground.
So it sounds like maybe there's, in addition to maybe the court just being kind of cumbersome and slow and not that effective, there's also competing paradigms of what needs to be done in order to move forward successfully.
Yes. Now, again, ultimately, I think you can have a both and. What often happens down on the ground is that you have a kind of battle between the punishment people and the forgiveness people, the justice people and the mercy people, and so forth. Well, it doesn't have to be either or. I think you can have the accountability of the courts, but also have, forgiveness and mercy and efforts to heal and restore. And that's ultimately I proposed a holistic conception.
And you have kind of this critique of, I guess, what you call the liberal peace, the underlying paradigm for the ICC, which is, you talk about how it's rooted in Rousseau, Bentham, Kant, and these guys. Can you tell us a little bit what you mean about what's kind of their philosophical contribution to the liberal peace?
Yeah, so I see it as having the Enlightenment pedigree, and where the real stress is on a political order that's revolves around individual rights, human rights, the rule of law, free markets, basic features of constitutional democracy. So it's basically establish constitutional democracy and then try the bad guys in the glass towers. That's what I would call the liberal peace. So law and rights are the core paradigm commitments. And again, I think those are important, very important, and they do capture, what justice is about. But I would argue it's not nearly enough, that you also need measures that are designed more to oriented towards healing wounds and restoring right relationships of people who have been wounded and are at enmity. And we have to look at the emotions and people's perceptions and at victims and listen to people's stories and try to deal with the kind of emotions and passions that can get in the way of a just peace, that if you don't deal with it, your democracy or your peace isn't going to last very long.
You've written in the past about the resurgence of religion on the global landscape. Are there ways in which religion is proving a force that maybe brings some of these aspects? Like where are some places where you're seeing that practice maybe take on a not so Enlightenment paradigm along the lines that you described?
Yeah. So along with this trend of countries facing their past, we also, another global trend of the last 50 years or so has been the rise of religion in global politics. At least so I would argue. And I've argued this with co-authors in a book called God's Century. But anyway, we argue that indeed global politics had become very secularized by the mid 20th century, following a long trajectory dating back before the Enlightenment, but gaining a lot of momentum around the Enlightenment, nationalism, Marxism. Those were all the kind of moving forces through the mid 20th century that in secularism within liberal democracy. And that kind of peaked out in the 1950s, 1960s. But then you started to see the rise of religion all over the world, in every religion, in every region. And I could document that if you wanted, I could detail some of that. But anyway, such that in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, we start to see religion resurging, in global politics in all sorts of ways, both violent and peaceful, democratic and dictatorial, but nevertheless involved. Well, if you marry the resurgence of religion with these political transitions, it's not surprising that religious leaders emerge in these conversations about how to deal with the past. And so in South Africa and Germany and Peru and Chile and Timor-Leste and so many other places, churches and religious leaders are involved in the conversation about, what would it mean to, restore after this terrible period of violence and injustice.
I think Tutu in many ways is the household example that lots of people have at least heard of in the South African context. You mentioned a few other countries, though, Chile. What are some of the dynamics that have gone on there, and who are some of the key players that are maybe less known?
Yeah, so I mean, as with Archbishop Tutu, in other countries, you've seen religious leaders emerge with a kind of reconciliation paradigm. Take Rwanda, for instance, where the government, after the genocide, the government implemented a kind of complex combination of trials and the punitive justice, but also restoration through village level forums and where people would testify, but also with some notion of healing and reconciliation. Well, there, the churches got involved in these local level forums and really steered them in the direction of being about forgiveness and reconciliation. But that was the influence of the pastors, and many independent kind of Protestant churches were really the powerful ones at the grassroots level. The larger churches, such as the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church, unfortunately had ended up being swept up in the genocide and implicated in the genocide, and therefore were not very powerful forces after the genocide. But some of the more smaller independent churches actually did have an influence, and one towards forgiveness.
So does it tend to be sort of a, maybe decentralized, more grassroots reality rather than, obviously in the case of South Africa, we have very central figures.
Well, certainly, now in some cases, it's a larger, more centralized church, such as the Catholic Church in Guatemala or in Chile, who's taking a national role in advocating reconciliation. But as you suspect, one of the abilities of a church is to get down to the grassroots. When you think about it, a church is a remarkable organization, at least when it's robust. It can deal at the top layers where the bishops are negotiating at the table with national leaders and so forth. But it also has pastors down to the level of the grassroots, and kind of one of the few organizations that sort of spans all sectors of society because of its nature and mission.
There's a phenomenon which I think I'm seeing a little in the U.S. today, where sometimes the leadership and the grassroots, as it were, however you want to characterize that, can be at cross currents about the goals, right? So maybe a leader might really be interested in talking reconciliation, but the feelings are too raw, among people. Are there examples like that we can see where there's kind of a, just real raw emotions and not really a desire to approach reconciliation as the first step?
Mm-hmm. Yes, there are, and oftentimes people say, "Well, I don't want to reconcile until there's justice. I want there to be I want to see the criminals tried. I want to see apologies and reparations, and I want to see this kind of justice done. And there are countries where people are quite skeptical of reconciliation, because reconciliation just becomes a kind of rhetorical tool on the part of the powerful for evading justice. Like, so for instance, the government of El Salvador, following the period of its dictatorships of the 70s and 80s and the wars that took place there. Later, they had a truth commission, but shortly after the commission issued its report, the state gave amnesty to all of the members of the military, and people were pretty skeptical. They thought the state talked about reconciliation, but people said, well, it looks to me like the state is just using reconciliation as a kind of evasion of accountability. That's just a kind of sheepskin for its interest. And I think reconciliation is more powerful and more accepted when people have a chance to enact it and live it on the local level, like at Rwanda, where they could, live it out at the village level, or places where it's encouraged by pastors or church leaders, or and oftentimes people don't necessarily have to see punishment, but they would like to see some kind of contrition on the part of perpetrators, or desire to restore on the part of perpetrators. Often when people see that, they're more willing to forgive and reconcile.
Okay. There's one aspect which comes to mind in the context of this idea of having an international criminal court, which is we don't have a world government, right? So in a sense,
Right.
when we have international institutions, we're kind of playing that weird dance between this doesn't really have any real authority, but there is kind of an international effort to bring consensus among sovereign states. Can you just talk a little bit about those dynamics?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big problems with the International Criminal Court is precisely that it doesn't have any enforcement powers. So, and that leads to great distortion. So let's say that look at a country like Uganda, where you had terrible atrocities committed by what was known as the Lord's Resistance Army, led by a guy named Joseph Kony, who got international notoriety as one of the kind of great war criminals of the world. Well, that's all well and good, and the Ugandan government supported these rebel leaders being tried in the International Criminal Court. They were going to be the first indictees. They were going to be the first ones to be tried. Well, the problem in Uganda is partly that the government also committed lots of atrocities of its own, the government's army. And so you have this kind of victor's justice, where the government is all too willing to have these guys seconded off to The Hague and tried. Those are its enemies, but you only get one side tried. And then you also have the question of enforcement. Who's going to deliver up the potential war criminals? Well, it's going to be the government, or the one who has the power to arrest them and send them along. Well, that means that whoever has the power or the monopoly of force in a country, if they've committed atrocities, well, their guys aren't going to be tried. So you have, one side, kind of victor's justice, where one side is the, supplies the people who face trial. But if you think about it, that can only deepen divisions in a society, because people who are on the other side will say, well, why are our guys getting tried and why aren't their guys getting tried? Which is likely only to deepen divisions. I mean, one of the basic principles of the rule of law is the kind of even application and fair application.
And if I recall correctly, you had written that it was sort of a Jeremy Bentham, whose theory of justice underlines this, right? That if you punish the criminals, future ones will be deterred.
That's one of the theories behind the court. Yeah. So it's like, I guess the idea is that if you try a guy in The Hague who committed a crime in Congo, well, on the kind of less ambitious theory of deterrence, which is still pretty ambitious, you would be deterring somebody else in Congo from committing another atrocity. But the really ambitious theory is that if you try somebody in Congo, from Congo in The Hague, well, the person in Cambodia or Peru or Uruguay is going to be less likely to commit a war crime. Well, I think it starts to get pretty far fetched. I mean, deterrence would have to really be effective on a global scale if people are going to see somebody get tried in the ICC and then say, oh, maybe I'll refrain from my, crime. I mean, we hope that deterrence would have some effect on, domestic systems where rule of law is effective, that if somebody is thinking about committing a crime, they would be less likely to do it because they actually fear punishment. When we have a working system of the rule of law, that can happen. But on the international scale, I don't think we're anywhere close.
So I want to, and maybe this touches on some of your earlier work in books like Revolutions on Sovereignty. But I think about the common story about the Peace of Westphalia in the 17th century is that it was kind of the first truth and reconciliation stalemate, right? Where you have these two irreconcilable sides, bitter feelings, and all right, you guys control affairs over there, you guys control affairs over there, but it is in a sense sterile, maybe along the lines that you're suggesting, that it doesn't actually get at the meat of reconciliation.
Yeah, I mean, Westphalia was a kind of modus vivendi, often seen as the end of about a century and a half of religious wars. And by and large, Westphalia put an end to fighting over the religious character of the regime. Not totally, there was a little bit of that left to come. For instance, like in the Glorious Revolution in England in 1689, 40 years later. But by and large, Westphalia tended to kind of put an end to religious conflict. And so what it did is kind of freezed in the Catholic Protestant proportion. So if the map showed that there were Catholics over here in Switzerland, but Protestants over here, or in Germany, you had Catholics in this region and Protestants that region, Westphalia basically said, we're going to just freeze it. Whatever it is now, that's what it's going to remain. And of course, for the Pope, this was a kind of a defeat of the hope of restoring the unity of the church. And the Pope didn't like the Peace of Westphalia very much. He condemned it in very harsh language. For Protestants who basically wanted their Protestantism to be a permanent thing, or semi-permanent at least, this was a victory. But by and large, it was a kind of modus vivendi, where it was basically a kind of, settlement between exhausted parties who said, we're not going to defeat the other, we'll finally agree to a settlement. The one, kind of exception to that, though, is that there were some kind of principles that informed the settlement to some extent, which was called what we now call minority treaties, which is that states were willing to allow minorities of the other religion to exist within their state. And they agreed to, freeze these proportions in, but often that meant like the Protestant prince would have to allow Catholics, or the Catholics to allow Protestants. And that willingness to allow members of the other religion did have some kind of, there was a kind of principled basis there for that. And so it wasn't just a purely pragmatic settlement, but it was a kind of, by and large, an effort to take these contended questions, off the table.
To what degree are the challenges we face with the liberal peace coming from some of the settlements there? I mean, we are operating in this world of sovereign nation states, which people often attribute to Westphalia being kind of the birth of that. I mean, how much of the problems that we face there are, in a sense, an unresolved consequence that we just don't have unity, that we have, sovereign spheres that each have their own say in their part of the world, but there's no sort of overriding power or consensus, really.
Yeah. So we're still very much in the Westphalian era, where state sovereignty is by and large overwhelmingly the primary authority. And so most reconciliation or most attempts to deal with the past happen within the country, within the state level. And so, but there have been some, stabs towards international authority. Um, After the Cold War, the UN started to take on a much higher degree of peace operations. You had the expansion of the European Union. You had the emergence of new institutions like international tribunals and the International Criminal Court. Um, so there were these efforts to kind of bring about some international accountability or some international justice. But by and large, the sovereign state remains overwhelmingly the key authority and the holder of authority, the monopolizer of violence. And in fact, even with the EU in recent years, there's been a move back towards the nation state. So we saw Brexit, we see the rise of nationalism in Poland and Hungary. And so the internationalizing kind of um, vector seems to be, pretty weak still.
Right, right. Take us a little bit. I know you've done extensive work on, Islam and the context of things like religious freedom in Islam. I imagine there has to be ways in which your work on reconciliation overlaps here, especially as we have in Islam maybe a more internationalist vision that in a sense challenges the nation state paradigm.
Um, well, yeah, so I think religious freedom is very closely related to reconciliation. With the resurgence of religion in global politics, we also see the resurgence of religious conflict and conflict between religion and the secular. And if it takes the form of terrorist and civil war, it can also take the form of repression within states where one religious community, a dominant religious community, doesn't respect the rights of religious minorities. And so religion is very much caught up in violence, tolerance, human rights, and so the question is on what basis can people of very different religions live together? Well, religious freedom basically says that people of different faiths have to respect one another and can't coerce one another's beliefs and can't use force to try to coerce others into conforming, and essentially calls for people of different faiths to live with one another with a certain kind of respect. It doesn't mean they can't advocate for their faith or evangelize or what have you, but it does mean they have to respect the full citizenship rights of people who don't agree with them. And so in that sense, religious freedom is a kind of reconciliation. It requires people who might otherwise want to dominate or to have, total control from, it requires them to say, no, I have to permanently live with a person of the other faith and permanently respect, their rights and their citizenship.
And so, there's probably always going to be a very strong need, assuming that the world is never going to become all of one opinion, there always will be kind of that need to live with, different notions. I'm curious to get your thoughts. You describe the liberal peace in a sense as the sort of overriding consensus, I guess, in which some of these points move forward. Does it have lasting power as the sort of de facto international consensus? I mean, obviously it has a lot of challenges from many sides, but it's not necessarily clear in the absence of another consensus what is an alternative.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Right after the Cold War, there was a book called The End of History by Francis Fukuyama. And his thesis was basically that the world had basically reached a kind of equilibrium of liberal democracy, where liberal constitutional democracy was now the legitimate form of government, was now the template that every state, should follow. And he would admit that not every state is there yet, not every state is a liberal democracy, but we're moving towards that, and that's the one that we're shooting for. Well, Fukuyama has gotten a lot of criticism. He was followed surely after that by Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, where Huntington argued for conflict based upon religious identities, said, Fukuyama, you're crazy to think that history has ended. Well, the critics are right. And I mean, history has not ended. Religion is still a source of contention. There are other forms of regimes that aren't liberal democracy. But I think in a certain sense, though, Fukuyama can be credited. And that is that there really is no major contender to liberal constitutional democracy in terms of legitimacy. I mean, most authoritarians don't kind of espouse an international authoritarian movement. In fact, they usually make excuses for their authoritarianism. They would say, well, this is kind of a state of emergency, or instability in my country requires this, or they may deny that they use certain methods or what have you. But, there doesn't seem to be a kind of major alternative contender for governance to liberal democracy. Before during the Cold War, there was communism. You could point to like an international communist movement that really thought that it was the future in the way of history. But that was defeated. There are still a few communist states, but the question is really like, how long will they last? Not, is communism the wave of the future? And in a way, I think Fukuyama could claim that more states are liberal democracy today than ever before in history. And so, as a form of government, I think liberal democracy has a lot of universal presence and staying power. Now, where I would question, though, is whether a kind of secular ideology of liberal democracy has to be the only way to do it.
Right. Yeah, because even in the course of this conversation, you've provided pretty strong critiques, at least implicitly, of kind of the liberal piece as you describe it, and it just strikes me that to the degree that is ultimately unsatisfying because of some of the maybe loopholes that you show in it, or cracks in the edifice, so to speak. There seems a strong impetus today to critique it, but it's not as clear what truly emerges kind of as a.
Yeah, what would be the alternative? Yeah.
So I don't know if you have any thoughts about the challengers there. I mean, obviously Huntington has his multipolar theory where you get kind of these Confucian sphere, Latin American sphere, and so forth. But
right.
But what that looks like institutionally, I think, is still a lot less clear.
Yeah. No, I thought Huntington had a lot of insight, and a lot of conflict does happen along civilizational lines. In a way, he can be credited for predicting September 11th, and for a lot of the conflicts that revolve around Islam and between Muslim majority and Western entities. So there's that, but still, I think there hasn't really been a successful challenger to kind of set up an alternative paradigm and say, this is the way of the future. I mean, it doesn't seem like, I wouldn't say that Muslim theocracies are kind of, growing around the world. There are some people who would like them to, but I wouldn't say it as anything like the kind of cachet of liberal democracy. But that isn't to say, I still think that religion makes a lot of difference in the world. Sometimes religion makes a difference within liberal democracy. And that's really what I would kind of hope for, would be a sort of liberal democracy informed by faith, and where faith gives a basis for and provides a content to politics within liberal democracy. And so part of the kind of thinking of secularization of the Enlightenment brand is that liberalism so that religion can only be a threat to liberalism. Whereas I think in a different paradigm, religion actually can reinforce and undergird liberal democracy and be a basis for it.
Right. Yeah. You just now you had distinguished between the liberal piece as such, and sort of secular ideology as its maybe main fuel these days. But there is a way in which maybe you can insert a new way of thinking into its institutions.
Yes. Yeah, that's what I would see. And so to see religion as kind of a leaven or a kind of spirit or a kind of an enlivening spirit of liberal democracy, and also something that offers a grounds for liberal democracy and a basis for it. And that's why I think that in general, I think that in the United States today and in other Western countries too, that to the extent that they lose religion, I think they're losing one of the main bulwarks of liberal democracy.
So, and let me ask you this: is do you see, in some ways, I would wonder, is that just as hopeless as some of the alternatives, in the sense of can we really see a way forward for a renewal of that religious spirit to reinform and give back its roots to liberal democracy, or are we kind of too far gone along that secularist ideology that you described?
Well, it does seem to be going in the other direction in a lot of ways, that despite the resurgence of religion in the last 50, 60 years, one now reads of evidence of secularization, particularly in the West. Maybe not in other parts of the world, but in the West, it seems to be the numbers are increasing of the nuns and the non-affiliated and so forth. But I would also remember and stress that history is not unidirectional, that people say history is going in this direction and it can't be reversed and it's like a juggernaut. But there are lots of examples of where the way that people thought history was going to go, it didn't go. And so we've seen religious revivals in American history. We also see surprising reversals. Nobody thought that communism would end, right up until it did end. Or on the darker side, that the attacks of September 11th would happen. Everybody then looks in retrospect and says, wow, the resurgence of Islam and so forth and so on. But until it happens, it's not that widely recognized.
Right.
So I would caution against the kind of, as Marx and Kant and Hegel would said that history is on this kind of train and it's moving in a certain direction. But I would make it more of a plea for freedom and for unpredictability.
Are there some areas that you identify as sort of sources of hope along those lines, or maybe just some strength that you think are overall there, that people have maybe overestimated their decline?
Yeah. Well, if we're talking about the rise of religion, certainly, in the global South, we see strong religious growth. One looks at the growth of Christianity as well as Islam in Africa, for instance, or ways in which religion is still very vibrant in Latin America or East Asia. And there are places, around the world where it has grown, even as this kind of a decline in the West. But in the United States, there are still strong religious communities. We still tend to be more religious than other Western democracies. And, for good and for ill, but I tend to think largely for good. And where religious people are being, inspired for a kind of positive politics and to inspired to bring about a more just liberal democracy.
So to take us back, full circle to where we started with reconciliation, take us through a little bit. What are some ways that we could see a sort of maybe a moral or religious revival of some sort, maybe reanimating the paradigm of reconciliation that you describe as inadequate within the liberal peace framework?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it would have to come from a kind of revival of religion to begin with. And then from there, we can hope that out of that energy, there might emerge the kind of application of in the case of Christianity, one of Christianity's most powerful ideas, which is reconciliation, God's reconciliation of the world to himself, and then the participation of humans in that reconciliation. But that really would require a kind of revival or reinvigoration of Christianity. And even though it doesn't seem to be that's the direction we're going in the last 10 years or so, one has to keep trying and to hope. And that's where maybe we look to our great evangelizers like Bishop Barron, or I look at, in the last 23 years, one example of the kind of maybe one of the great example of so vibrant religion is the papacy of John Paul II. And here he was in a communist country that had long discounted religion, and became Pope and led a mass movement of hundreds of thousands of people to ultimately topple the communist regime. And then just went around the world and had followings of millions of people follow him, and set an example of forgiveness and reconciliation and healing towards the past. He spoke that message in so many ways. But you look at the kind of energy and following and enthusiasm that he generated. Well, it's hard to say that the world is just simply a secularizing place.
And yeah, I'm reminded of a parallel. One of the difficulties that you hinted at with reconciliation is, if we don't punish, others will think that they can get away with things. And I think of a parallel almost in something like nuclear arms reduction, that nobody wants to be the first guy to disarm.
Yeah.
So, I guess my question would be, how do you get over that kind of difficulty where, everyone's clutching the knife and like, I'll put it down if he puts it down, but will I really put it down?
Yeah. Right. Well, one thing is reconciliation efforts usually come after a transition, like to democracy or peace settlement or something. And so that's where your most difficult negotiation happens, where people are not willing to be the first mover because they don't want to make the move and then have the other side not make the move, and then they get squeezed out of the peace settlement or what have you. So reconciliation is often negotiated in a slightly less pressured environment, but there still is a strong sense that people have that if reconciliation is going to be one-sided, then it's not very attractive. If the Truth Commission is only going to look at one side's atrocities, or the trials are only going to try one side's criminals or what have you, that it needs to be broad-based. And so you can see conversations about that in Rwanda and South Africa and so forth, where one group is saying, well, all this reconciliation talk is very nice, but really all that amounts to is that we have to give in. Why doesn't the other side cooperate? And so, that kind of, I don't want to move because the other side isn't moving dynamic is still there.
So as a final point here, you had hinted at briefly that, I guess, the ultimate basis in Christianity for reconciliation, which is Christ reconciling all, through himself to the Father. Could you take us a little bit more there in the territory of the theological roots of reconciliation?
Yeah, so that is the basis of reconciliation. And the term is used most commonly by the Apostle Paul. The term is used some 15 times in the New Testament. 13 of those are in the letters of Paul, and he uses it to describe God's reconciliation of the world to himself through the cross and resurrection. And the important thing is that is seen as an actual restoration, or at least the event that makes that reconciliation possible. That is an actual restoration of persons and relationships. It's not just a transaction or a deal that was done or something like that. It involves actual impartation of grace that would restore people. And Paul describes that reconciliation as applying to all things. So in his letter to the Colossians, he says that all things are reconciled through Christ. So that implies a holistic notion by which everything, not just individual souls, but also political and social orders, will be restored. And our envision is being restored through cross and resurrection, and ultimately to be consummated in the new heavens and the new earth, a phrase which also implies that everything is going to be restored. So it's not just as though, these good people go up to heaven and off to another realm and so forth. And No, the actual heavens and earth are going to be restored. So that then implies the vocation of the Christian for participating in the God's restoration of the world means to actually work for repair in political and social orders. The final thing that I think is really cool also is that reconciliation can be described as a concept of justice. So Paul describes reconciliation through the Greek word dikaiosune, um, which can mean comprehensive right relationship, but I would argue that it can also mean justice, as the Greek word dik implies justice, and has been interpreted as justice in the Latin tradition of the Vulgate, and there is a tradition of interpreting it as justice. Well, if that's justice, then that's a little bit different notion of justice than that which applies to the kind of dominates the modern West, which is the constant will to render another his due, which means rights and retribution. And I think those things are good, and those things are part of justice. But I think what is being envisioned is a much broader, more holistic restoration of relationships than the due consideration can encompass. And so if it's justice also, it means that, well, it should have a lot to do with political and social orders, because we constantly talk of justice as if it's something that applies to society. So if we can recapture the meaning of justice, that might have real possibilities and implications for politics.
I think about it from the point of view of, charity isn't just like bonus points, right? Of
Yes,
going above and
yeah,
beyond the strict requirement, that there is
that's
sort of
right.
God demands of us in his justice a sort of charity level of approach to our neighbor.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the due conception applies, well, you've kind of done your job if I, pay back the $5 or whatever, or pay my bills on time, or that sort of thing. But Christian charity goes a lot more than that. It involves solidarity with the poor, and hospitality, and mercy, and forgiveness, and things that go beyond what is expressed by due.
And you introduced there as well the concept of that eternal dimension of the new heavens and the new earth, which I think in the reconciliation context can help us remember that you might not be able to shed raw feelings, right? You always might have a lot of anger towards people who might have done something to your family or your people, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily what reconciliation requires, is for you to get over your feelings. It just requires a posture of forgiveness, of reconciliation towards enemies. And
Yeah, and in a Christian conception, also, the role of grace is extremely important. That grace makes possible things that might not have been possible anyway. I think it's one of the reasons why, in a lot of these contexts of countries dealing with what we might call radical evil or violence on a large scale, it's Christians who speak about forgiveness even in these kinds of contexts, whereas more secular conceptions don't want to speak about forgiveness. Partly they don't think it's possible, but also they have real objections. They say, well, that just burdens victims in ways that are obscene. That's a term they sometimes use, as obscene, or that it really is just a kind of twisted way of thinking. Why would, after terrible violence, why would you say that the job of repair is on the part of victims? Now, again, there's something to it. We don't want to place all the job of repair on the part of victims. But I think that if we see it in the context of Christ, or in the context of grace, forgiveness is not just kind of something that re-victimizes the victim. Forgiveness is done something that is empowered by Christ, who stands in solidarity with and encompasses victims into himself and into his body. And because of that, then forgiveness is actually a kind of participation in Christ's reparation of the world. And through forgiveness, a victim can actually become a kind of an agent and a kind of cooperator with God, rather than just a kind of, re-victimized person. And so, but this, in fact, I think is why forgiveness is much more plausible to people who have a religious outlook, a Christian outlook, that they can see their way to loving the perpetrator by willing his forgiveness, which makes sense in light of Christ in a way that it wouldn't make sense if the forgiver is all alone.
Well, I think that's a really good point on which to wrap up our discussion. Always end on a high note, right?
Yes, well, hopeful. Hope, I think, is the key word.
Exactly. Well, again, thank you, Professor Philpott, for joining us today. Really interesting discussion, and grateful for your time.
Oh, thank you. And all the best to this great project you've got going. I really, really love what you're doing. So
Thanks so much.
thanks, Eduardo. Yeah.
Talk soon.